I'm glad to see you all. Not really trying to chastise anybody. We are so few, it's always good to see when you show up, so I'm grateful. We've been studying in the book of James, and we're in chapter 4, and I thought it might do well for us to maybe review a little bit, but then finish out the chapter. James is continuing to teach us some very practical ways as to how we can construct a godly life. And speaking evil against others is a common pitfall that we encounter. And it's so easy for us to do that, and yet at the same time, it's not something that God is pleased with. So we need to ask ourselves as Christians as to why that happens. Why do we struggle with the things that we think and the things that we say? And what do we need to know so that we can overcome that sin? You'll notice in verse 11 that James says, do not speak evil against one another. And he calls them brethren. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. There's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you who judge your neighbor? So, as we said, why does this happen? What do we mean when he says, speak evil of one another? That expression itself is a good definition of one word.
Defamation.
Defamation of character or slander. That's the word we usually apply to it. So that's one thing he's making us understand. And there are all kinds of synonyms and other terms that are used in place of it. Now, as we've talked before, James is not forbidding discernment here. He's not saying it's wrong to carefully evaluate someone's belief or their behavior, but he's talking about character assassination. He's talking about the slander that we think about and then sometimes say. So why does it happen? Well, as we said, one of the reasons is because we believe that we're putting somebody else down and it elevates us to a higher level. Well, we may believe that, but that's not true. In fact, we're really lowering ourselves in the eyes of God quite a bit. And not only that, but it happens because we tend to play a very dangerous game. We put ourselves in the place of God. We may not think that or look at it that way, but that's exactly what happens. We're guilty of doing this when we judge others too harshly, when we judge them unfairly. And yes, we do need to realize that discerning judgment is necessary and it's part of the Christian's life. We need to be able to judge the wolf in the sheep's clothing, for example, as that's the example that Jesus gives. And also, when we judge others too harshly and unfairly, we are actually putting ourselves up as if we have the right to make those kinds of judgments. And we're putting ourselves in the place of God. We're presuming way too much and boasting in ourselves. So I think there's an all too critical tendency today to be super critical of others. And to turn that around, we want to go easy on ourselves. And that shouldn't be the way it is. So why does speaking evil against others mean that we're speaking evil against God's law?
He has commanded us to love one another. So if we speak evil one against one another, we're no longer abiding in love, and God is love, and He is expecting us to care for one another in that regard.
Okay. we're actually speaking against that law of liberty that God has given us, hasn't he? And the thing that you said about what Jesus said about loving God and about loving your neighbor as yourself, this is the royal law as James referred to it. So when we think about that, we're talking about the fact that we simply have decided that we don't have to worry about that. That's one of those things we can set aside. But the problem is you can't love a person and slander them at the same time. That's incompatible. And speaking evil against others means we're slandering, and we're actually speaking evil against God's law. And if you're speaking against his law, if you're saying, I don't like God's law, I don't like this law as it applies to me, then we're saying we really don't like God. Because we're choosing to ignore various commands that the Lord has, like, as you said, love our neighbor. Back in James chapter 2 and verse 8, you remember James said, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You're doing well. So, James is not telling us, and he spent a lot of time talking about the tongue, hasn't he, back in chapter 3. But he's not merely telling us to just watch your tongue, because he wants us to realize when we speak against that, we're speaking against God. And we've set ourselves up as judges over God's law. So when we break that law on a regular basis, then we're implying that we don't believe it's a good law for us to be under. And it has to do with any law that God says. So rather than seeing this as God's law and doing it like we're supposed to, and doing it with a willing heart, as working to strive to improve our condition before God, we decide that's just not something that's really that important. So the tendency is to set up our own set of rules and play by those, except that's not the way God wants it to happen. And James points that out. He said there's only one lawgiver and judge, and that person is neither you nor me. So he's the only one who gives the law, and he's the only one who can stand in judgment of the law. And it's like in verse 12 when he says, who are you to judge your neighbor? Well, who do you think you are? That's exactly what he's saying here. Who do you think you are? As if we had the right to stand up and question and sit in judgment on God's law and question his commands, rather than just meekly obeying. Yes, Cindy?
Are we talking about like not judging? Because like in Matthew it says, judge not, but yet it still talks about like the Diotrephes in, I better get my first and third John, we are judge, we do judge, or the man that was having his father's wife, there is a judgment.
Sure.
But are we saying that, so we're not supposed to judge anybody, or are we more saying that we're not supposed to let our opinions judge anybody? Is that where, to me, this is saying don't judge, but I'm thinking it doesn't quite match up with what everything else is saying as well, is we're not really judging if God's law is judging. So I'm trying to.
Okay. Well, God's telling us very clearly, we don't judge. What does he mean by that? And as we've learned before from what Jesus says, you have to be able to determine right from wrong. And Paul clearly does that in 1 Corinthians 5, when he says, take this fellow, get him out from among you, deliver him to Satan. That's a responsibility that we have. So deciding there's a wolf in sheep's clothing in the midst is something we have to be discerning about. So we have to be careful about the situation that we're looking at. We don't want to do something unjustly or unwisely. Yes, Steve?
Yeah, you use the word, we've used the word judge and we've used the word discern. And they are two different things completely. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes in, is that when you look at this, discerning something is objective. Okay, so to discern something is not based really on emotion, it's based on understanding. Judging is an act of evaluating and labeling and passing final sentence. So there's a difference in discernment from judgment. We are told to discern, no doubt. We have to discern. But a lot of times when people think of judging, we think of it as, I'm evaluating the right and wrong of this. That's really, that's not, he's telling us not to judge, but he's
Right.
not telling us not to discern.
Okay.
And it's really, that's the big difference is between discernment and judgment.
Yeah, we use a lot of terms in a very similar way, like discernment and discriminating and being discriminating in the sense of deciding the difference between things, whether it's right or wrong. Person comes in for an interview, for example, you have to be discerning about whether or not you want that person to work with you, things like that. But we don't have the right to get to the gates of heaven and hell. And judgment in that sense does not belong to us. And when God's law tells us something's wrong or something's right, we do the right and we do our best to not do the wrong. So, is that what you're getting at, Cindy, or is there more to this?
Well, I can see where this passage would be a struggle for some people to understand, because it says, do not judge. And I've had that comment put to me, like, you can't judge somebody.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, that's what Jesus says in Matthew 7.
right.
Judge not, lest you be judged. So what is Jesus saying there? Yes, Donna?
My Bible dictionary defines the speak evil against as accusing.
Well, it's simply another word for slander. Speaking evil is really the definition of slander. And you said it's what?
Accusing, like accusing somebody of something.
Falsely.
Yeah.
Accusing falsely, yes. That happens a lot.
So maybe more of our opinion in this kind of situation than this is what God says. If somebody is doing something God said don't do, that's obvious. It's not a judgment in any way.
Yeah. This is not a matter of opinion.
Yeah, and the example you used, Cindy, where you were talking about the man who had his father's wife, okay? They're not judging him. That's not what that's about. That's not about judging him. That is about his behavior is disruptive in the church. His behavior is sinful behavior. You can observe his behavior as being sinful. And it doesn't say to judge him, it says to put him out of the congregation that he might be saved. There is no judgment there saying he is condemned for this. This is saying that he is disrupting the congregation. He is committing a sinful act that's obvious based on behavior, and they said to put him out so that he may be saved. They're not judging him as being going to hell. They're saying, get him out, put him out, and pull away from him so that he may see the error of his ways and change.
So do you think then, as congregations, we've done this incorrectly in that, like, congregations will judge somebody like they've missed too many services, so therefore we're gonna put them out?
the skill of understanding and applying God's word to distinguish truth from error, right from wrong, good from evil. Yes, it's somewhat judging, because what you do when you judge, you take the facts and you declare, do they work for or against the standard? And what is our standard? The standard is God's word. What God deems right, what God deems wrong. Are your actions, your behavior laid against God's rule, the ruler? Does it match up? If it's not matching up, then yes, it is a judgment, a discernment of saying, you're not doing as God has demanded and ordered. You need to make a change. That's what we see in 1 Corinthians, and then we also see that in Matthew 7, because that's basically saying, do not judge, because you're going to be judged also. So do not be hypocritical.
Yes, Steve.
Yeah, no, I disagree with that, Gerald, and this is why. Judgment, in order to judge somebody, you will pass sentence. When it says, judge not, lest you be judged, it's saying, do not evaluate the situation and pass sentence. We do not get to pass sentence. And you can't use discernment and judgment interchangeably. It's two different things. And what happens, we tend to want to put judging and say, judge not, in that you cannot evaluate that what somebody else is doing is inappropriate or wrong. We can. That's discernment. We can look at the situation, look at the behavior, and say, this behavior is what you were trying to say, was this behavior is in opposition to God. Therefore, this behavior is incorrect. We're allowed to do that. That's not judging. Judging comes to its completion when you pass sentence, and only God can pass sentence. And I think that's what it's getting at. That's the only way you can come to the fact that there is no contradiction between judge not and discern things. In other words, otherwise you're going to find contradictions all over the scriptures over the fact that we're not supposed to judge, but we're supposed to judge. Use two different words, two different ways, in two different contexts.
I think some of that comes from what John says, judge righteous judgment.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
And I know the world, and that's what I was referring to in the way that the words are used today. We use those words, or people use those words a lot.
And I think we misuse them.
But I think you're right in the fact that when you judge, you're actually passing a sentence
Not to pass sentence, judgment.
on someone. Yes,
I just looked that up, it's John 7:24.
yes.
Yeah, thought you might like to.
Read that for us if you would.
Oh, well, I just Googled it and looked at what Google.
John
said.
what?
John 7:24.
You got it, Gerald?
I got it.
I just looked at the AI and got the scripture verse.
Tell you what I tell my students, don't depend on ChatGPT for something.
No.
Well,
Um,
that was just to get where it was found.
Let's back up a little bit to get more of the context of, this is Jesus in Galilee. He is teaching. This is the Feast of the Tabernacles. He's let's see. Jesus in verse 6, then Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is already ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it, that it works evil. You go up to this feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. When he had said these things to them, he remained in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up, then he also went up to the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. Then the Jews sought him at the feast and said, where is he? And there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, he is good Others said, no, on the contrary, he deceives the people. However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, how does this man know letters, having never studied? Jesus answered them, said, my doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine, whether it is from God, or whether I speak on my own authority. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? Then the people answered and said, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered and said to them, I did one work, and you all marvel. Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to the appearance, but judge with righteous judgment.
Okay, when you go back up to verse 19, you'll notice he said, did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you carries out the law? That's in essence what we're talking about here in James. It's like James is saying pretty much the same thing. God's law is the royal law, and yet you're not paying any attention to it. So what are you supposed to do about this? And they've made a judgment here. They've already condemned Jesus. They're just looking for a way to put him to death. Yes, that's true. But I know when we read this, we think the same thing, I think, here that we do when we read James. And I think this is where people tend to decide that they have the right to sit in judgment on God's law, and they don't. When we decide any one of God's laws is not something we ought to keep, then we put ourselves in the place of God.
Cindy, in speaking about the way the world would look at this, anytime you would bring something against someone of the world, trying to say this is against God's law, they want to holler, you are judging me. That's probably the only verse they know.
Yeah.
But you're judging me. No. I am trying to show you what God says. You made the judgment call.
Yeah, like I said, we use that term judgment in a lot of different ways, or judging. And so you have to be real careful. I don't know if we're getting at the root of what you're getting at, Cindy, but
I think so.
we're trying.
Exactly, but I think that's where the problem is what Linda was talking about, like, you get thrown at you like, well, you can't judge me. Okay, in a sense, I'm not judging you. You need to go see what the scriptures say.
Right.
But I've also seen, like a woman who was divorcing her husband because he was going to whorehouses or watching men, it was even homosexual men dancing nude, and yet she was being judged that that wasn't right because, well, there was no evidence of fornication, so therefore you can't do that. I see where we get off track sometimes, trying to judge correctly, but yet at the same time we judge too harshly when God hasn't made those judgments. Does that make sense?
I think I'm getting what you're saying.
I think we've gotten in
when actually it is an evaluation that we've made. We don't have the right to judge like God does. Yes.
Because we cannot pass sentence.
I'm sorry?
Because we cannot pass sentence.
Right.
Only God can.
Yeah,
pass
we have
sentence.
no right to do that whatsoever.
That's correct.
She just basically summarized what you've been saying about judging harshly and where we have no point, where God has not judged harshly. That's why he says here, do not judge, because you become the judge. And there is only one judge, and that is God.
Right.
So,
Yeah, it's like that case in 1 Corinthians 5. Evidently, the congregation had already decided that it was okay, or at least they didn't say anything about it. It was accepted. But Paul says that's not what God says about it. He said, you deliver such a one to Satan. And we're trying to save his soul. That should be the Christian's intent on anything that has to do with how we live before God, how we think, how we speak, how we live. We have to remember we are not in the place of God to have that right to make judgment calls like that. Another thing that I think he's talking about, the area of discernment here, is in verses 13 and 14. You'll notice James goes on and says, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business, make a profit, and yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. As we look at this, I think we exhibit a lot of pride in thinking that we have control over our lives. And I think we get to acting like we have control over the things that will happen to us. Can you imagine the situation here, these that James is describing? Individuals, maybe a group of businessmen or whatever, sit down and decide, we're going to go into this city. They've got to determine how far away it is, how long it's going to take them to make this journey. Are they going to need protection on this journey? And what is it going to cost us? And are we going to be able to make a profit? And it's very similar to the things today. We sit down and we calculate. And as we say, we make a judgment call on what we want to do. The problem is so many leave God out of the plans in all of this. And that's what James is telling us here. There are days in our life when everything in our plans that we've made changes. And it happens suddenly. We cannot afford to ignore God's principle here. I don't know exactly. I think James is addressing really everyone, not just individuals, but he gives us 4 different arguments here that reveal the foolishness of ignoring the will of God. And this first one has to do with how complex our life is. I don't think that we realize all that's involved in life. We try to. The older we get, the more we think we know about life. And we've learned from a lot of different experiences in life, but we also know that those things can change at a moment's notice, don't we? We never know when something's gonna take someone we love from us, or some kind of situation, a car wreck's gonna happen. There's just any number of different things that change our plans immediately. And what it really boils down to is, apart from a life in God, life's a mystery. We deal with it as best we can. We try to make plans, and he's not he's not saying that you're not supposed to do that. I don't think we should get the idea in any of this that we shouldn't use wisdom in striving to figure out how to live our lives the best way we can. But the thing about it is, we sing the song, "This is my Father's world," and this is the way Christians look at it. If they're truly placing their lives in God's hands, then they understand something about this. And this matter of the uncertainty of life, this, Proverbs 27 and verse 1 says, "Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth." So here are these individuals, even in our day, who are making plans, maybe a whole year. We make plans even a lifetime ahead. I mean, we buy life insurance and things like that. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that if we decide this is where we can go and we're going to stay here and we're going to buy and sell and make profit and we're going to do this and that, all without any consideration for what God wants in the matter, then we've made a serious mistake. You remember that story in Luke 12 about the rich farmer who his grounds brought forth so bountifully he was going to have to tear down his barns and build bigger ones? And what does he say to himself? Take your ease. Yes, take your ease. You've got things laid up for you for many years. Don't have a worry in the world. Well, did he get a surprise? And we know what that is. So, "Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Luke 12 and verse 19. Well, verse 20 says, "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee." So when we have a situation like that, we realize life is not uncertain to God, but it's uncertain to us. So only when we're in a vital relationship with Him can we be confident about tomorrow. We spend our time so often worrying too much about what's going to happen in this life and not near enough worrying about what's going to happen in that one to come. So this is one of the repeated themes in the scriptures, the brevity of life that James talks about. We measure our life by birthdays and things like this, and that's the way everybody does it, but there's no such thing in eternity. And life, James says, is but a vapor. It appears for a little while and then it vanishes away. You remember so often Job made comments about the brevity of life. He said, "The cloud is consumed and vanisheth away," in Job 7. "Our days on earth are a shadow," Job 8 and verse 9. "Now my days are swifter than a post," or a weaver's shuttle in another passage. In this one, he's referring to the royal couriers that hastened on their mission. And in Job 9, they're passed away as swift ships, as the eagle that hasteth to the prey. And then in chapter 14, man that's born of woman is few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not. God tells us to number our days that we might get a heart of wisdom. So after we learn to live one day at a time and do it with God's help, it's something that is so valuable to us, and we certainly don't want to waste our lives, but God reveals His will in His Word, and yet most people just simply ignore what God has to say. And then He says in verse 16, "As it is, you boast in your ignorance, and all such boasting is evil." Man's boasting only covers up his weakness. Man proposes, but God disposes, one man said. Solomon said it first. He said, "The lot's cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord." Proverbs 16 and verse 13. We can't control future events, can we? We have neither the wisdom nor the power to control the future. We can't see it. We don't know what's coming, and how silly we are to think we can control it. So if we're going to boast about this, then we're making a serious mistake. You ever been down in Carlsbad? It's dark, isn't it? To me, that's kind of like what the Lord said about outer darkness in the scriptures, being cast out into outer darkness. I can't imagine what it's like to be in dark like that. One thing I learned when we were down in there, they said, stay close to your guide. And that's exactly what we need to be doing as Christians in this world, is staying close to our guide. Because there's days everything's going to change. We strive to live our life, but to think we absolutely have control of it is just silly thinking. We can't afford to forget how short our life is. As we think through this, you'll notice one of the things he points out at the end here is we're kind of proud of our pride, I think. Proud of our abilities. May sound kind of strange, but you know, he says, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. We're proud of our plans. We're proud of the things we accomplish. But what does all this mean if we're not really paying attention and paying attention to God? It matters greatly, God is telling us. It matters to him how we think about our future plans as much as does the actual pursuit of our future plans. It's interesting what Solomon said back in 1 Chronicles 29, verses 11 and 12. He said, yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you're exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. When Daniel was in captivity, he said, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, of iron, of wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and in whose are all your ways, you have not honored. It's a pretty fitting statement to the way so many live in the world today. Have you ever thought about the fact that we're ignorant of the future, but it's good that we are? Why would you think that?
Would we want to know if we're going to have that car accident and pass away on the way home? Would we even move? I mean, we would be fearful of moving if we knew what was coming.
Yeah, we'd never get out of the bathtub, would we? As the expression is. It's interesting, isn't it? If we knew tomorrow would bring prosperity, what would we think? What would happen? Just like this guy we talked about in Luke 12. What will we do? We'd become careless. We'd become presumptuous. We'd decide that, I've got it made. I don't have to worry, yes.
And we see that in the history of the Israelites and even in our world today. When the Israelites became rich, peace, and so forth, they forgot that God was the source of all that, and they said, well, look at what we have done.
What church was that in Revelation? Remember Laodicea?
Yes.
We're rich and increased with goods. And he said, you're wretched and poor and miserable and blind and naked.
It breeds contentment, and we forget that God is the source of all things.
Yeah. And the other side of that is what you mentioned, Cindy. if we knew tomorrow would bring all this kind of adversity, we'd never get out of bed. So it's interesting, isn't it? We can never afford to lose sight of the brevity of life. In Psalm 39, David said, O Lord, make me know my end and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you've made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. And James says life is but a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. So what do Christians do? They learn to submit, don't they, to the sovereign will of God. They believe in God's divine providence and the fact that he works in the world. He's not just letting it run the way, he created it and turned it loose to do what it would. They believe God wills and God works, and he wants to work in each one of us, as we learn in Philippians. He wants us to work out our salvation, but in conjunction with him working in us. I think that's sometimes the thing that we overlook in that passage, and it's very important that we don't do that. And if we decide that we're going to just disregard and remain indifferent to God's providential oversight of both life and death, I think together with all of our decisions and their outcome, that's arrogance. And that's this kind of sinful boasting here that James is talking about. So, we need to stop acting like we're in charge. And that stands for all of these things. Our real question is, where do we stand before God? I want you to ponder that. I'm through with the lesson. I appreciate all of you being here this evening. I don't think we're going to sing an invitation song, but is there someone you think about that we need to remember in our prayers? Do you know how Patsy's doing? Is she improving or?
I haven't been able to get a hold of her,
Oh, okay,
so I assume we're probably the same.
okay. Your folks okay?